Mr. Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. My name is Elizabeth Bauer and I'm the director of the Office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for the Baltic countries. I'm very much honored to welcome all of you for the foundation in the name of the foundation to this presentation of research results regarding the challenges for the armed forces in these overall challenging times. Those who already had a look in the book will wonder that one country around the Baltic Sea was missing. Sorry for that, but the promised chapter wasn't delivered. Ladies and gentlemen, just now we are already facing the next wave of the pandemic. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to think about the outcome for the forces, as well as for the challenges regarding the international security environment. When I see all the high-level representatives, it seems to me that not only we and our partners of the National Defense Academy of Latvia, but you as well think the topic is worth to be discussed. Before I will give the floor to the director of the Defense Academy, I would like to thank all authors for their contribution, and a very special thank you to Toms Rostock and Gunnar Gavrilko from the Defense Academy and my colleague Jeva Jakobsone, who realized this project. Thank you for this work and for the trustful cooperation. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude that Minister Pabriks accepted the invitation to give a short input. But first of all, I now give the floor to Jānis Beržins, Director at the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy of Latvia. The floor is yours, please take over.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'll be brief. I just want to thank the book editors, Toms Rostock and Gunnar Gavrilko, and the authors as well, for having this idea and making it happen, because this issue is very important. I mean, since the beginning of the year 2010, yes, there is within NATO scientific community, there is a great demand for understanding the new roles of the armed forces in modern times, because warfare changes, it develops, and as we've seen in the last years, there is an increase in using non-kinetic means to achieve military objectives, and therefore there is a huge debate about the role of the armed forces, and this issue, which is the relationship between society and the armed forces, and what the armed forces can do in times of crisis, is of extreme relevance. Therefore, again, I want to thank the editors and the book authors for a very needed volume, and I wish you all a good day with very interesting discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And now I give the floor to Mr. Minister Artis Pabriks. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to everybody. And first of all, thank you to all the contributors of this book, because it is timely, even if when I'm looking into the book, I see that it was published still before vaccine appeared in our shelves. So I would say there is already time for some renovation work on this brochure. But speaking about armed forces and our armed forces, for instance, and their contribution and connection with such crises as COVID-19, I think we can draw a lot of comparisons, and we can try to develop a lot of ideas out of this. So, of course, this book is also contributing to that, and I'm very happy that one of the authors, along with Toms Rostock, is also Gunnar, which is, I would say, without exaggeration, a very, very important worker for me here in the Ministry of Defense. So thank you, Gunnar. Now, as far as the armed forces, I think this morning discussion on Konrad-Adenauer contribution, and thank you to Konrad-Adenauer contribution also here, is very timely because today we have a meeting of Cabinet of Ministers, which starts at 12 o'clock. And I have to present in the Cabinet of Ministers actually the results and the analysis, how far are we with comprehensive defense system in this country. And as you know, comprehensive defense system was developed by our military and Ministry of Defense in order to prepare the civil institutions for different types of crises, and in order to prepare a better coordination apparatus between the different civil institutions and military, again, in different events of crisis. And of course, now we can see how this comprehensive defense system could contribute or could not contribute also to the pandemic of COVID-19. First of all, about comprehensive defense system as such. I think we are pioneers at this moment in Europe because we have been the first one among EU countries to lift again this question about comprehensive defense system on a modern basis, speaking about not only military crisis, but different civilian crises, about cyber threats, about hybrid threats. And now we can see that a number of other countries are starting to follow our pattern. One of them is Great Britain, which also told that they are starting to work on the comprehensive defense system. We also know that Lithuania now is very deeply involved in analysis of what we have been doing up to now. And that basically means that we cannot in future envisage any type of certainty regarding crisis if we are not speaking about the very close cooperation between civilian institutions and military institutions. Now, by telling this, I also would like to reflect where do we stand at this moment as a military force regarding the times of pandemic. Of course, nobody abolished for Latvian military their major goal to be always able and capable to defend our country and to make the right contribution also to our common security as far as the NATO. At the same time, we also know that military are in different countries on a different scale involved also into the fight of pandemic COVID-19 by helping civilian institutions. If I would like to complain here, or at least draw the attention of analysts and experts on the role of military, I would say that sometimes I have a feeling that at this moment in Latvia, military and our army and Ministry of Defense is compared to something like between Cream Bepanthen and Donkey. Because from that perspective, it seems that whenever some kind of a smallest or larger scale problem appears in a civilian institutions, everybody is looking to us and telling, look, you in the defense sector are receiving now 2% or a little bit more because of the decrease of GDP. Now you have to be ready to assist. Of course, military is always ready to assist. And just like doctors, we can't say no. But there are certain limits and there are certain requirements also from our side. And the minimum requirement is that also civilian institutions in the peacetime and in the times when there are no crises should be capable to think how they will act in the events of crisis. And this is what we have been already preaching before this pandemic appeared. And our preachingness was institutionalized by organizing about 26 exercises for different civil institutions, including the Ministry of Health, before the pandemic. We institutionalized also exercises of so-called Kristaps, which is for our government to go into the forest, into tents, and to analyze different types of crises. I think that at the very beginning of COVID-19, these exercises helped our civilian institutions to coordinate each other's work. But it seems to me also that at this moment, some of the lessons have been already forgotten. So from that perspective, I would like to say that all the civil institutions should continue, first of all, keep into the mind that management of crisis is not a sole responsibility of a military and defense forces. There must be a minimum of preparedness of every and each civilian institution to be ready to tackle whatever crisis might appear. And to answer the question, what they will do in the event of crisis, how they will respond, what type of resources do they have available, for how long time these resources are available. I'm very sad that we did not manage before COVID-19 to put all this task on the Ministry of Health of Latvia, because we have been exercising with Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Economics, and you know from discussions in Latvia that we have been a vital source as a Ministry of Defense to initialize the questions about oil reserves to be stationed in Latvia. This is our political push here. We are also now in the mid of discussions and organizing hackathons regarding the food reserves. But the health issues, of course, are always at stake. And whenever crises appear, I am not speaking here even about war, health institutions must be prepared also to tackle and to work in the system of crisis. The same applies also to Ministry of Education, etc., and etc. So just not to be too long, but still, I would very briefly like to remind what exactly the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces have been doing during the COVID-19. First of all, our readiness is on the same level as it was before COVID-19. We are ready to defend our country and our nation. Secondly, yes, we have been cutting back on some of the international exercises, but it was not undermining our ability at this moment to do our direct job. Thirdly, as far as the assistance to civilian institutions, we have been for a long time deployed and involved into assistance of border guards and state police whenever they have been curfew or also checking our external borders. So daily about 100 persons from our National Guard or military are on the borders assisting police. Secondly, we have been very crucial to assist different municipalities in different care houses, social care houses, also with sick people, where there have not been a personnel, where some other people could not do this. We were going and doing this. Thirdly, I would say that one of the most important contributions in our case is as far as the procurement. Because suddenly when we came to the procurement of different defense equipment, masks, whatever was needed for our doctors, for our schools, for anybody who is using this equipment, we have been asked to provide the purchases because we have the right approach to logistics and we know how to do the large-scale procurements. That, of course, takes a lot of resources from our own procurement. And I must say that because of this, I will ask also Cabinet of Ministers to allocate us 5 additional positions, simply human positions for people who could work with this, because that demands from us also external resources. And next week, I will present in the government also our plan, how can we assist additionally to the Ministry of Health with vaccination process whenever vaccines will be finally available. And I must say that at this moment in our defense forces, in our army, actually everybody is doing their task without vaccines. I was just pushing through that today in the government we will agree that our soldiers who are going to international missions will be vaccinated because without that I will not simply send them to those missions. But next week we will go along 3 lines. First, we will be ready to assist Ministry of Health in all the vaccination centers which will be established. Secondly, we are ready with certain preconditions. I'm not going in details to also organize a mobile vaccination points because people who maybe cannot leave their houses, who are living in lonely places or who are alone, they need assistance. Army will be there if needed, but there are certain preconditions from Health Ministry which I need to be fulfilled. And thirdly, we are ready to assist also with certain capacity of logistics of distributing vaccines if it will be needed. Prime Minister asked me also 2 weeks ago to prepare the plan B, where all the logistics for vaccination will be taken over by the Ministry of Defense. Here comes once more my reminders about donkey and Pepperton, because I think that at this moment there is no country in the world or European Union which is taking or asking military to take all the logistics on their shoulders. But we will prepare this plan B. We will be ready to do this. But of course, if we will come to this, and I hope we will not come to this, then the certain preconditions should be met. In general, what we can learn from COVID-19 crisis and other crises for our defense and security in Latvia, in Europe, and globally. This was a nice example how we were not prepared globally in general for the COVID-19, because this will leave traces, and we all will be weakened on the individual level, on the national level, and on the international level, including also security-wise. Secondly, it shows us that the next crisis probably will be not a health crisis, but something else. So be ready for the next crisis. Thirdly, to be ready for the next crisis, we cannot rely in a modern security environment only on the defense forces. We need to rely on the very precise cooperation and previously worked out plans on the cooperation between military or enforcement authorities on one side and all type of civil societies on the other side. Speaking humanly, that basically means that also civilians, which were in daily lives not used to speak or think about security and also defense, be ready to start to think about this, because security is an integral part of our life, and we cannot overcome any type of longer-term crisis without good cooperation. And finally, I would say also that we are living in very difficult times globally, because international cooperation, I think, is under the big question mark. So we rather get ready for a better cooperation internationally within European continent, transatlantic-wise, which is now also a big challenge after the Trump administration, and also with all our partners. And here I speak globally with such partners as Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, India, etc. Because without such cooperation, we can't overcome non-military crisis as well. Thank you. I will finish now. If there is any comments or questions or complaints, I'm ready to take them now.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. And we said before, if you would like to do a comment or a question, please use the chat for that. You can even raise the hands if you can see it, but not all of them are on the. I can see at one time. So if you have something, please put it in the chat as well. I don't see.
Nobody is interested, which is also good.
I think because you gave a very, very good overview of all the aspects, and so it was perhaps nothing to add again, because you already put it in by now. So thank you, Mr. Minister, for being with us. First of all, I do know that you will listen to us, but that you have to leave to go to the next meeting, and I would give the floor now to Toms Rostock, who will moderate the first panel. Please, Toms, take over.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good luck with all your work with Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. You're doing
Thank you.
a good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Jānis. Last year in spring, when the pandemic began, a lot of our activities were put on hold, perhaps indefinitely, and we discussed with Elizabeth of still trying to do something meaningful, and also we had the idea to do something small. And of course, the outcome is a book-length contribution, which took bit longer to put together than we originally envisaged, but I think we can be quite happy with the outcome. And really, when the pandemic began and countries started to close borders, everybody understood that, well, this is a health crisis. Clearly, there's no question about it. But at the same time, it was also clear that it would have implications for national, regional, and international security. So it was clear that there might be a temptation for governments to, let's say, deprioritize national defense because the crisis is actually, there are threats to human security. It also became clear that instead of being, let's say, last responders to whom we rely when it comes to national security and defense, armed forces can also become part of the problem if there are large outbreaks, and there were indeed large outbreaks of COVID in the American military, in French military, and I'm sure there have been other cases as well. But then, of course, armed forces were also to be part of a solution. And although Minister Pabriks mentioned that sometimes the expectations regarding armed forces are too high. You know, whenever there's crisis, we call upon our military to deal with it and contribute in some way. And perhaps that expectation is indeed too high. But also it's clear that nation states have, to some extent, relied on contributions from their military organizations in tackling this crisis. Also, another brief remark regarding the timing and publication of this study. This study intentionally was to be published before the pandemic is over, if it's over for real at some point in near future. I think that very often we have a tendency to suffer from hindsight bias, meaning that when we look back at the events, then the sequence of events looks very logical, makes too much sense. And events look almost predetermined. So actually, the aim was to publish this in the midst of the pandemic, and then that would be actually valuable material for subsequent studies, because it may reflect that, you know, the interim results during the pandemic might be really different from the conclusions that we draw at the end of this pandemic. All right, so we will proceed in the following way. So time to set some ground rules for the subsequent discussion. We have two panels. In the first panel, we have a contribution on NATO, Poland, Sweden, hopefully, although I do not see Mikael Jonsson among participants at this moment. And we also have a contribution on the Finnish case study. And the way we will proceed is that each panelist will have 5 minutes to characterize the developments in defense policy and the involvement of armed forces in tackling the COVID pandemic. Of course, NATO's chapter stands out in terms of substance because it doesn't deal with specific nation state. So we will have 4 contributions, hopefully. Each contribution should not exceed too much the 5-minute limit. And after that, we will have some time to address questions, and I'm sure that there will be quite quite a few questions asked, indeed. And as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, please use the chat function to ask questions, because for technical reasons we don't have everybody on the same screen. So there are two screens, as I see right now. So please use the chat function for that. And once we will be done with the panelist opening remarks and the Q&A session, then we will proceed to the second panel, and I will then hand over the moderating functions to Paul's Raudseps. But we will start with the chapter on NATO. So the pandemic affected NATO, and the big question was how NATO can retain readiness, and how can it make a positive contribution to its member states' security, although NATO wasn't really created to tackle pandemics. Please, Thierry, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Tom. I hope that everybody hears me well. And okay, thank you. And I want to thank Tom Rostock and Gunnar Gavrilko and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for the invitation, both to contribute to the project, the book, and also to participate today. I also need to start by a disclaimer. I speak on my own behalf, not on behalf of the NATO Defense College, nor on behalf of NATO. So I understand we have only 5 minutes, and I'm going to deal with 3 issues about the role of NATO facing the pandemics. First, defense posture. Second, NATO's response. And third, what COVID says about the alliance. So the first point, I think, that deserves some attention, and Tom's and also the minister alluded to it, is the imperative for NATO as a military alliance that is mandated to deter and defend, the imperative to remain a credible defense actor in the time of pandemic. So the first primary objective that NATO had to serve was the maintenance of NATO's operational readiness before anything else. So that is important that that issue is being mentioned. So what NATO has done to preserve that readiness has to do with protective measures, but also resilience being revisited. It's the narrative about the health crisis not becoming a security crisis. But the top priority was that NATO remains a credible defense organization. And it's important that we start, whenever looking at what NATO has done, by that imperative. The second issue is, in this context, NATO did play a role in support of others, in support of civilian authorities in the broad response to the pandemic, not as a first responder. And I think from the very beginning, it was clear, because of the nature of the crisis, because of the nature of NATO as a military alliance, that NATO could only be in support of others, but not be the first responder. NATO did not pretend that it would bring the response to the crisis. It was also only in support of other actors better placed to play that role of providing the response. There are at least 3 reasons that explain why NATO contributed to the response to the pandemic. One is a kind of relevance imperative. Because of the magnitude of the crisis, NATO had to be part one way or the other of the response. It had to demonstrate some sort of relevance in the response to that crisis, given its magnitude. It would have been politically difficult not to appear as being part of the response. The second reason has to do with NATO's capacities in the field of coordination, transport, logistics, protection. NATO has a know-how, has some capacities that did help in fighting the pandemic. You've heard about the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, which is the civil emergency response mechanism of the alliance. So the EADRCC played a key coordination role between states allies and partner countries that did ask for assistance, and countries and partners that provided some assistance, and the coordination that NATO played was important. There was also a role in facilitating air traffic that NATO played. NATO also created a pandemic response trust fund to acquire some medical supplies and other equipment, the constitution of a stockpile that is now being used again, helping countries that would make the request. And the third reason that explains why NATO was involved is the necessity to respond to some disinformation that was made and that targeted NATO. So some fake news, and I think in the Baltic states, you are well placed to know what I'm talking about. Fake news about the spread of the virus, about the role that NATO would play in spreading the virus, and hence forward presence was also targeted by those disinformation campaigns. So NATO was involved in understanding, unpacking what was happening, but also responding through Stratcom, Public Diplomacy Division did play an important role in being transparent about what NATO was doing and responding to the fake news and disinformation campaign that was orchestrated partly by Russia. And the third point is about what the pandemic says about NATO. That's about cohesion, that's about adaptation, that's about relevance. In terms of cohesion, I think it is fair to say that because of the nature of the American administration a year ago when the pandemic started, the transatlantic relation was not the easiest. So there was an issue of NATO's cohesion, at least for the first 10 months or first year of the response. But then in a post-COVID world, when that world comes, there will be issues about possible divergences, about where priorities should be. The defense investment pledge to be met in 2024 will be probably challenged because of the impact of the economic crisis. So those issues will come back. It was already mentioned by the minister. And in terms of NATO's adaptation, now NATO is facing the debate that again the minister addressed about at the NATO level, NATO's adaptation and how it should play a role in facing health issues, non-strictly defined military issues at a time when NATO is starting a process of revisiting its strategic concept. What role should resilience play in that new concept? What kind of role should NATO play in the field of not only resilience, but addressing health issues, pandemics, or similar challenges, making sure that if NATO was to be addressing such issues, it would not be at the expense of the maintenance of NATO's credible defense, deterrence, and defense posture. So that leads me back to the point with which I started. The challenge for NATO is to maintain its defense posture, but while being able to offer a response to multifaceted threats. And the pandemic is just another example of those multifaceted threats that NATO has to, one way or the other, respond to. Thank you.
Thank you, Thierry, so much. Your input on NATO is really appreciated, because not least because at research division of NATO's Defense College, of which you are the director, you have published over the past year quite a few contributions dealing with the issue of pandemic affecting NATO, affecting international security more generally. It's great that NATO Defense College Research Division takes an active part in discussing those issues. The next presenter will be Piotr Szymanski. He's a research fellow who's part of Regional Security Program at the Center for Eastern Studies in Poland. And Piotr wrote the Polish case study. So please, Piotr, the floor is yours.
Toms, thank you for this kind introduction, and of course, many thanks for the invitation to this webinar and the invitation to contribute to this book. It was a great pleasure to write on Poland's military response and aid in this pandemic crisis. So a great pleasure to contribute to this unpleasant topic. And in terms of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, year 2020 was very tragic for Poland, and the second wave hit Poland exceptionally hard. It was October and November when it took place, and overall in 2020, Poland recorded more deaths than in any year since the Second World War. So it shows the scale of the pandemic, and actually Poland recorded the highest rate of excess deaths in the entire European Union if you compare it to the previous years and annual average. So it was over 20% more deaths than this average rate from previous years. So on the one hand, it was due to the COVID pandemic directly, and on the other hand, it was due to the bottlenecks in our healthcare system. So it shows you that armed forces contribution and assistance was really necessary. So Polish armed forces provided vital help and aid to not only to the healthcare system itself, but to other uniformed services as well. I mean, police and border guard. So basically, healthcare systems and uniformed services were overstretched by the pandemic, and due to the lack of sufficient capabilities or personnel, this aid was necessary. So armed forces were visible in hospitals, airports, border posts, and took place in logistics efforts, participated in increasing testing capacities. So it was the armed forces response in terms of this aid. So currently around 6,000 military personnel is involved in providing this assistance. Maybe it is important to mention as well that Poland hasn't declared any kind of emergency situation, which is envisaged in our constitution. So this aid is being provided on the regular basis, so non-emergency regular legislation. And discussing the effects of the pandemic on the armed forces in 2020, it is worth to highlight the fact that actually Polish armed forces were starting 2020 preparing to the largest military drills in our recent history, so Defender Europe 20. And we ended up with having the biggest crisis management operation since 1991. And I wrote in my chapter about plans to actually boost recruitment during the pandemic. So here we can already observe that pandemic actually hindered recruitment in processes in the armed forces and in terms of reserve soldiers exercise, they had to be stopped as well. At the end of December, around 1% of military personnel was directly affected by COVID and infected and isolated. And in terms of military expenditures, Poland is doing pretty well. So in this respect, the COVID pandemic hasn't been a game changer for our defense sector. So in 2020, it was 2.3% of GDP. It should stabilize around 2.2% next year's. And what about the future? I think that the contribution of the armed forces to these containment measures will evolve and will adapt to a vaccination program. So currently around 1,000 troops is involved in helping with vaccinating population, and there are mobile groups helping to reach people at home. Plus, I would like to emphasize that Poland in 2020 has published a national security strategy, which plays a vital role in our defense system and the future posture of armed forces and defense expenditures. So it puts more emphasis on civil defense and preparedness. It mentions COVID as a direct threat and highlights a need to create our integrated security system. So it shows that more attention is being paid to this comprehensive way of thinking about security. So yeah, my last point would be about territorial defense forces. So it is the youngest branch of Polish armed forces, and its contribution to countering pandemic was very important. So around 10,000 troops were involved in these operations in 2020. Half of them were territorial defense forces, so this voluntary branch. And they relieved operational forces during this scaled down military exercises, and in fact took over the duties of civil defense. So they filled the gap in Polish crisis management system and were able to create this positive image of territorial defense forces, probably ending discussions on the reasons behind territorial defense troops and whether it is good or not good to have them. So they were really visible and had a great contribution. So I will end here, and I look forward to receive some questions.
All right, thank you, Piotr. And thanks for reminding that the pandemic really has affected armed forces in a variety of ways. You mentioned recruitment, for instance. This is also a topic that armed forces had to deal with and reorganize for that. Our next speaker will be Henry Vanhanen, who's a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Finland. Unfortunately, we are missing Mikael Jonsson today because it seems that there's a minor crisis at his institute, where there's no internet at this point, apparently. And if internet will return, then we'll try to replace, reschedule Mikael's contribution for later on. But now, please, Henry, you wrote a chapter on Finland, and one curious outcome of that chapter was that it seems that defense spending is bound to increase in Finland. even despite the projected economic effect of COVID. So please, the floor is yours.
So good morning on my behalf as well, and thank you, Thomas, for the opportunity to participate in this project. I think it's very important to look at the role of armed forces. It's been a major topic during the COVID-19, and as you mentioned, Finland has been somewhat a different case compared to several other European countries. While the pandemic is expected to have a serious impact on Finland's economy, the defense sector in the country has remained relatively stable. The government of Finland has maintained its support for defense procurements, and European security remains tense. Thus, it will be unlikely that the pandemic will have a serious or severe impact on Finland's strategic defense priorities in the short or long term. I have to begin with when assessing the impacts of the COVID-19 to Finland's defense, one has to understand that the special role of national defense in Finland, as it forms a distinctive feature in the security dynamics of the Baltic Sea region and Northern Europe. Unlike most of its Nordic Baltic neighbors, Finland is not a member of NATO. And at the end of the Cold War, as the perceived military threats in Europe decreased significantly, territorial defense and collective defense became less crucial as many European countries cut their defense spending. Now, in the case of Finland, of course, it maintains national defense-focused system based on a national military reserve and a large reserve. At the same time, Finland updated its national defense capabilities and continued to participate in international operations. So, in other words, unlike many European countries, Finland did not completely follow the trend of downsizing defense capabilities. And it's an indication that Finland has taken its national defense seriously and continues to do so today. National defense is widely appreciated by the Finnish society. Studies conducted on the will to defend the country since the 1970s have indicated that the willingness of Finns to defend their country has remained among the highest in Europe. The most recent results indicate that 68% of the respondents felt that Finns must defend themselves with arms, even if the result seems uncertain. And in addition, 77% of the respondents were in favor of maintaining the current system of compulsory and conscript military service. And several other studies have indicated that the Finnish Defence Force are among the highest trusted institutions in Finland. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, the potential harm to Finland's national defense has remained modest. While utilizing certain precautions, the Finnish Defence Forces have mostly been able to continue their normal exercise and training routines, both nationally and internationally. This is mostly because of the COVID-19 situation in Finland has not been as bad as in many other European countries. As of August 2020, the Defence Forces already had returned to their normal cycle of refresher exercises, and the pandemic has not had a major impact on these exercise activities. I mean, regardless the otherwise relatively minor impact, the cancellation of the Arctic Block exercise that was a major setback. The Arctic Block was going to be the largest exercise in 2021 with a planned 20,000 participants and participation from 13 international partner countries. And its purpose was to exercise the defense of Finnish territories alongside partners. Now, if you think about the armed forces in Finland during the pandemic, I would say that their most visible role was perhaps in assisting other authorities with the ramifications of the pandemic. However, the Finnish Defence Forces never had the main role in countering the ramifications. And this is mostly due to Finland's comprehensive security approach. And in practice, this is a whole of government approach to security in which tasks and responsibilities are divided between different authorities. And also, when you think about the COVID, notably there has been no wider public demand for defense budget cuts in Finland. This could be partially explained also by the current level of resources for the defense forces, because in 2002 and 2015, between those years, the defense forces went through a structural change and significant budget cuts. And this process was not met with praise, and also raised some critique that the Finnish Defence Forces staff is suffering from work overload, and has raised the question whether the Defence Forces has sufficient resources. And for years now, the defense administration in Finland has voiced the concern that Finland cannot afford any more defense cuts if it wants to uphold a credible national defense. And therefore, I think it would be hard to find plausible justifications for additional defense cuts without compromising the demands on Finland's national defense at the moment. Significantly, while the pandemic is taking place, Finland is also in the process of replacing its Hornet fighter jets. And this project is known as the HX fighter program. When completed, this acquisition will be the most expensive procurement in Finland's history. The HX project started in 2015, and the government of Finland is scheduled to decide the acquisition on this year in 2021. There have been certain individual voices and statements that have claimed that Finland should postpone the HX fighter jet procurement process and reevaluate the whole process. However, the Prime Minister of Finland and the Minister of Defense of Finland have both spoken on behalf of continuing the process according to the planned schedule. Significant cuts to this process or postponing seems thus unlikely. And what is also paradoxical is that as Finland is making these procurements, Finland's defense spending may actually increase up to 2% of the GDP, even though Finland is not a member of NATO. And concerning that in some countries it's going down, downwards the trend of defense spending. So in Finland it's going to be the exact opposite. And I would say that last but not least, as the security situation in Europe has worsened after Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its military activities in eastern Ukraine, a tense security dynamic is developing in the Nordic Baltic region, and the military importance of the region has grown, and also alongside with it the military activity. And the military presence in the Arctic has also increased. So as long as the wider standoff between Russia and West continues, the need for increased preparedness in defense policy remains. Thus, it seems unlikely that the pandemic would change the general Finnish view on the importance of national defense and improving capabilities, nor just the general threat perceptions at the moment. In the long run, the strategic emphasis in Finland's national defense will remain unchanged. And in practice, this means that Finland will continue its strategic procurement programs and to engage in international defense cooperation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Henry. At this point, the floor is open to questions, and if you have any, then please submit those questions by using the chat function. Also, in the meantime, I should emphasize that Elizabeth has used the chat function to extend a very generous offer, meaning that if any of you would like to receive the printed version of the book free of charge and with free shipping, then that is a possibility. You'll just have to drop them an email to info.riga@kas.de. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? While others are probably still typing, I would like to ask Thierry regarding the relationship between pandemic and NATO. In your introductory remarks, you were severely limited by the 5-minute limit, obviously, but you mentioned that there might be some relationship between the pandemic and the NATO's new strategic concept. Do you think pandemic will kind of play into that process, and if yes, then in what way?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for the question. So as I'm sure many of you know, There is no formal decision as we speak to revisit the strategic concepts, but NATO Secretary General has expressed his wish that that would be the case, and the decision will be taken at the summit that is to be organized before the summer. So it is likely that the process will start in the fall, but it is not certain at this stage. If it happens, to respond to your question, I think it would be very difficult, given the situation that we are going through, to ignore pandemics or to overlook the topic in any kind of new document. So it is indeed very likely that the issue of pandemics will be addressed, but beyond pandemics, you also have that term that is not new to many of the countries that are represented in the book, but maybe a bit more new for NATO, which is the concept of resilience and the ability of an institution and its allies to respond to threats that are not of a traditional nature, and the ability of NATO to coordinate those allies' policies and to bring some kind of a significant response to those new threats by being more resilient. And resilience is likely to feature one way or the other in the concept. Again, because NATO has to respond to the nature of the new environment, and if the new environment includes threats such as pandemics, then NATO has to find its place. And I think that leads me back to the challenge that I started with, which is that on the one hand, NATO as a security institution has to demonstrate a relevance in tackling issues that have security implications. On the other hand, as a military organization, as a military alliance, NATO has to maintain its credibility as a military actor. So anything that is being done at the first level, addressing the diversity of threats through a kind of security resilience lens, should not be done at the expense of the core key central role of NATO, which is to deter and defend. And I think the challenge is in finding the balance between those two issues. It's not new, and that debate has been with us since the end of the Cold War and since at least 2014 with the Ukraine-Crimea crisis. On the one hand, NATO has to be a credible military actor that deters and defends. That's what NATO is about. But at the same time, there is a wide range of threats out there, hybrid, cyber, pandemics, and you may have seen that over the last few weeks, the NATO Secretary General is talking a lot about the implications of climate change, the security implications of climate change, and what NATO could do to respond to those consequences. So it's just another example. So the challenge is to maintain the right balance between the hardcore defense role and playing a role in addressing the security implications of those threats that are multifaceted in nature, but other threats to allies that need to be tackled one way or the other also by NATO.
All right. Thank you, Thierry. I don't see any additional questions at this point, so probably we can proceed to the second panel, and there will still be an opportunity to ask questions during the second panel, as I believe that participants of the first panel will remain with us. So with this, I will gladly pass the floor to Paul Streltsevs, please.
Thank you, Toms. Yes, the pandemic, the onslaught of the COVID-19 illness and the new coronavirus on our societies has, in places, been compared to war. It's a huge exogenous shock that causes immense damage to our societies, that requires the societies as a whole to mobilize to overcome it. The fight against this virus means that we have to invest all our possible resources to overcome it. Otherwise, we won't be able to return to normality, whatever that will mean after this pandemic. So the comparison to war, while not perfect, is in many ways apt, and therefore it's also apt that we're talking in many ways about the role of NATO and the role of armed forces, because they are one of the pillars to defend society in cases when society as a whole is threatened. And so I think this is a very important book to look at this, in some ways expected, in some ways unexpected challenge that we are facing right now in the Baltic region, and use it as both a point of reflection and a means of comparison between how the various countries have dealt with this and what we can learn from each other. And I think for the second panel, this is the main point that we will be getting, is that looking at how 4 different countries have, then their militaries have confronted this crisis, what they have done, what has worked, what possibly could be improved, that we will also get a better understanding, first of all, how to overcome this crisis, and considering the fact that, as we hear from many experts, this may not be the last pandemic that we have to face, how we can deal with similar crises in the future. We have 4 authors, 4 panelists to talk about this, reflecting the whole, let's say, the whole horizon of the Baltic Sea area, from the west to the east. And I think from our program, we can start with Mr. Robin Allers, although is he here, Toms? I don't see him among the speakers. Robin, are you here? Or will you be with?
You should see me.
You're tardy. Okay, didn't recognize. I hope you won't be tardy in speaking, and you're very, very. You've come here first to talk, so that's very good. Robin Allers is an associate professor at the Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies and the Norwegian Defense University, and will be speaking about how the Norwegian Armed Forces have dealt with the COVID pandemic. So please, Mr. Allers.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone involved in this project. Also on behalf of my co-author, Paul Sigurd Hilde, who of course let me take the floor today. Perhaps to start, when you look up information on the defense sector or any other topic on a government website these days in Norway, and I presume it's the same in any other countries, you usually get a notice that you should be warned that this information might be outdated because the pandemic is changing so fast. So this is the case for all the documents we used in working with our documents. You get this warning: this might be outdated. Please check constantly on the websites for current information. So this basically tells you that in writing and in dealing with this topic, in writing this chapter, we pretty much were looking at a moving target, as the Minister of Defense has also already mentioned. Still, I think for us and for others involved, this has been a very interesting project to work on, to assess how the defense sector has performed, how it has dealt with the pandemic, how it performed during the pandemic, how it adapted and continues to adapt to this crisis. And also, as the editors asked us to do, to place this topic in the wider framework of international and European security policy. In writing our chapter, we profited from a number of documents, because the Norwegian government was at the time of the crisis publishing a long-term defense plan, kind of a national security strategy, a 4-year plan with a time perspective of up to 8 years, a long-term defense plan, and also simultaneously a white paper on societal security. And both these papers, the long-term plan was first published in April and then had to be reviewed and included a reaction to the pandemic. But both papers reflected on the impact of the crisis on the defense sector and security in a wider range. And they also highlighted what in a Scandinavian context is called total defense. So civil military cooperation and the need to address security in a much more comprehensive way. So in a way, what the Minister of Defense called comprehensive defense concept, which is in the Scandinavian countries mostly known as total defense. Shortly after we turned in or finished our chapter and turned it in, the MOD also published its own evaluation of the defense sector's handling. And I only, for those of you who speak or read Scandinavian or Norwegian, I highly recommend to have a look at this document because it nicely complements what we've been writing. And of course, it offers a very, very detailed timeline of decisions and interaction within the defense sector, with other ministries. Importantly, also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it comes to Norwegians living abroad and international cooperation. So this kind of evaluation was extremely helpful to understand how and when the defense sector and the government as a whole reacted to the crisis and what it meant, where the defense sector came in. Interesting also as on parts of documents that the MOD proposed several temporary legislation throughout the crisis, in a way emergency legislation, but which will have a meaning way beyond the crisis probably. One dealing with the assistance of the defense sector to the civilian sector, and one regarding persons as myself, a civilian working at a defense institution, the proposal for extended rights for the armed forces to order civilian personnel in a crisis. This is of course important because the government or the armed forces realized you have a country, you have personnel spread all over the country, all have their rights, want to take holidays, need to travel, have to face restrictions. Is the defense sector able to order these people in an emergency to move, to take on other duties as normally? This is legislation concerning only the defense sector and is limited, but it was important to update legislation for the civilians working in this sector. From in our chapter, just very briefly, we draw three main conclusions. The first regarding the pandemic's impact on the general security environment. And in the short term, you would say there hasn't been much of a significant impact, but the long-term plan and other statements from government side noticed, and experts tend to agree that the pandemic has in a way highlighted a number of worrying concerns with regard of the impact of especially great power rivalry, the role of actors like Russia and China, but also the US, to put perhaps their national interest before the interest of the whole. Another impact, and related to this, the weakening of multilateral institutions and the general multilateral framework. And a third one, a tendency towards nationalism, populism, and also measures that might undermine the societal cohesion through disinformation and cyber effects. So that these trends might be highlighted or enhanced through the crisis, but also they showed in a way some vulnerabilities of the security sector, and the government's evaluation highlighted especially the dependency on China on many critical function capabilities. So reducing these dependencies is a key lesson. The second is the economic impact, and there Norway, as you might know, has this fantastic sovereign wealth fund, which helps the government to shield itself against the main economic impact, and has enabled the government to set into place stimulus measures that are also directed at towards the armaments industry, for example. So the main procurement programs weren't affected, and in general, the economy fared quite well. But also here's a huge but of course, Norway is a small and very open economy, and if this pandemic continues, the Norwegian economy will be highly dependent on the general rate of recovery of the worldwide economy, and also procurement programs, of course, will be affected on how other partners are faring. So Norway, of course, cannot shield itself against these aspects and these consequences in the long term. The third conclusion then regards the defense sector itself. Its involvement has been important, but also quite limited. There has been assistance to the civilian sector through border controls, through air support, medical support, but overall it's been rather limited. But it's been of course very important, and as I told you before, there's legislation in place to try to improve this even more. But it's important to say that the defense sector has been hit quite hard by the pandemic, of course. First of all, through the cancellation of training and exercises. Just now in March, there were supposed 10,000 soldiers in Norway training in Joint Viking, which has to be cancelled, and also other training had to be cancelled. This doesn't affect the readiness and operability so far, but it's of course a huge blow to the defense sector. And of course, as the rest of society, the armed force has also been hit by restrictions on traveling and so on. Important, because we haven't talked so much about this, I want to mention international operations, which of course also are hit through a long quarantine, both before deployments, in and under deployment. So this is something that also, when we look to the future, will be a huge problem. And now we're talking, of course, about vaccination, where you need to establish prioritized list on who gets the vaccine first. So Norway just decided that it's Afghanistan, the forces deployed to Afghanistan, who will get vaccinations first. But Norway has decided early on to maintain all the personnel in operations. But these deployments have, of course, been heavily affected also by the pandemic and all the restrictions related to it. So I stop here and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Pauls, your microphone.
I'm sorry, just to be polite, I muted myself and then I forgot to. Thank you, Mr. Allers. We'll leave the questions for the end, and I remind you that you can write them in the chat even now so that we can ask them when all the speakers have finished. Our next speaker is Mr. Kalev Stoichescu. He's a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security in Estonia, and will be talking about the Estonian experience. Please, Mr. Stoichescu.
Thank you very much. Hello, Pauls, and many thanks to the organizers and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. It's a great project on a very actual topic that would probably remain with us, unfortunately, for years ahead. And many thanks to Yeva, Toms, and Guna for putting together, making a wonderful book that I've really looked thoroughly into. I started my own article by stating that Estonia is among the least affected European countries by COVID-19, but the reality has sadly changed in the past months, and now it is one of the most affected EU and NATO members at this point. But I very much hope that the newly instated restrictions and responsible behavior of fellow Estonians would lower rather sooner than later the level of contamination with the coronavirus. So I outlined in Estonia's chapter the main challenges presented by the pandemic to maintaining the country's initial self-defense capability. That includes the NATO's EFP battalion-sized battle group that is embedded in the 1st Infantry Brigade of the Estonian ground forces. I also explained the role played by Estonia's armed forces and the Voluntary Defense League, very important, the sister organization of Latvia's Zemersats and Lithuania's CASP, as well as the Ministry of Defense in supporting our country's civil authorities and structures in planning and conducting crisis management by the country's government, and also providing resources. For instance, the deployment of a military field hospital to Kuressaare, the capital of the island of Saaremaa, when the people of the island and the hospital there were in deep stress, as well as providing, for instance, a large quantity of masks for the population, and also especially for the medical personnel. And also by providing specialized volunteers from the League of Defense to assist, for example, testing sites, COVID-19 information call services, and even to support the border guards at the eastern border and Tallinn's port terminals when the border control was temporarily activated during the state of emergency in March to May 2020. But now a few critical months have passed since I wrote the chapter, and Estonia has even a new government since that time. And therefore I would like to rather update some things that I wrote over there. First, Estonia's defense budget was kept nominally at the same level as in 2019, which means that the percentage of GDP on defense expenditures has grown, and it may even grow further in order to keep up with the demands. And the Ministry of Defense also adopted recently a development plan for 2022-2025 that is rather ambitious, because the threat assessment indicates that the pandemic has not diminished Russia's determination to confront, threaten, and undermine the West, as we see it. Quite to the contrary. And we witness how the Kremlin uses even the Sputnik V vaccine and its so-called vaccine diplomacy, in quotation marks, as hybrid warfare weapons these days. So Russia's strategic exercise Zapad 2021, that probably would be due in September, together with Belarus, would give us a clearer picture of how their capabilities stand now in these times of pandemic, and how their readiness is. And although I'm quite sure that they would exercise all in all the same things they have done in 2017 as well. So Estonia's MOD plans to fill in significant capability gaps in the coming years with additional increases in defense budget, particularly in the areas of coastal mid-range air defense and also sea mine warfare. There are, of course, repeated cases now coming back to the pandemic of quarantine and self-isolation in the armed forces at this moment. But all in all, the Estonian Defense Forces copes well with the situation, and the conscription service continues. This is particularly important because our defense system is based on conscription and reserve forces. And as the Norwegian speaker previously also mentioned international peacekeeping operations, I should state that our armed forces continue as well as planned our contributions and missions, including with units in Mali, Afghanistan, and Iraq. and some other places. But what I find particularly important and interesting in the MOD's and Armed Forces Development Plan is the part of the section on COVID-19 and what to learn from the pandemic as a crisis and how to implement lessons learned, which is pretty much learning by doing because of uncertainty and because of the novelty of the situation. There are many important aspects worth reviewing. For example, the government deals perhaps too much with details of crisis management. That is more the job of professional crisis management staffs or HQs, so to say. Maybe that is a problem in other countries too. And the bureaucracy tends sometimes to slow down quick and smart solutions. As for the country's military defense, for instance, laws could be changed to allow the Estonian Defense Forces, this is my opinion, then in certain very clear emergency situations to take immediate action in case of threat or attack. Then there are aspects that relate to local governments, for instance, of counties, of the local administrations that have perhaps to show more flexibility concerning peacetime military exercises, including those involving reservists in this time of crisis that we have right now. And then also the private sector that we see that is willing and ready to assist the state and the Estonian Defense Forces in times of crisis. And these private companies should be better engaged in the defense efforts and plans as we see it. Now, last but not least, what to say? These are particularly difficult and challenging times in all respects. However, I believe that Estonia takes deterrence and defense very seriously and is determined to increase its capabilities in readiness in accordance with the threat assessments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kalev. Well, we'll skip back over to the other side of the Baltic Sea now. Jeppe Plenge-Trautner, I hope I pronounced that approximately right. Danish is always difficult in that sense. But in any case, he's an external lecturer at the University of Aalborg in Denmark, and we're speaking about the Danish experience. Mr. Trautner, are you?
Thank you very much, Pauls. So, dear participants, dear colleagues, I am in uniform today, yet I am speaking for myself. I'm speaking as a scholar, not as a soldier right now. The Danish experience, as described in the book chapter, it gives occasion for 3 observations, and I think what the others have said earlier today just strengthen this. The first observation is that military forces are very versatile. Military forces can assist civil society and have done in many countries, yet I see a pattern in the book and in the chapters. In those countries where the armed forces are more often used to assist civil society, it's more efficient. So pre-planning in this matter as well helps. If society and military are used to work together, it goes well also under COVID. The second observation is also quite obvious, and others have referred to it. COVID set back the training and the changes of the NATO militaries quite a lot. All of us have been challenged by the Russian change here since 2014 and even before. And most forces in Northern Europe are transitioning away from expeditionary forces to forces that can defend NATO territory if need be. COVID set those preparations back by, if not a year, then at least quite some. Some countries, and in particular my country and Germany, we don't have a strong political and civilian agreement of what the Russian threat will mean to us. And still, COVID is a distraction from the preparations towards NATO's aims. For all armed forces, COVID has been another wolf in the pack, another challenge to us. And that is not quite true, because here comes the third point. I've been looking at what Russia has responded to militarily in relation to COVID. And to me, it seems that the Russian forces have initially scaled a little bit down, but then they have decided that the risk of COVID did not merit them stopping their training. Here I have an observation from Denmark, which I write about in my chapter. Already in September, the Danish armed forces had a successful exercise, successful in the sense that also they managed with 2,500 soldiers participating to have only 2 participants who were infected by COVID. It is possible to have large-scale exercises in spite of COVID and with very little risk of transmission of COVID. I have to say, I just returned last week after 2 weeks in Poland, where I was in Bydgoszcz at the Joint Forces NATO Center of Training. We were about 800 participants in the exercise there, and as we could see it, it looked like about 5 participants were infected by COVID, and they were infected before the joint exercise. So again, we see the military forces manage to adapt and make sure that COVID does not spread during exercises. As I'm here today in uniform, it's because I'm a reserve officer, apart from being a scholar, and I'm participating in the preparation of a military exercise to take place in Latvia. Thank you very much. A very hospitable country and very helpful in this exercise, because the Estonian, Latvian, Danish cooperation in the multinational division North will have an exercise in April. And having learned from the Polish example also, we will do our utmost to avoid transmission of COVID during that exercise. So to sum up, 3 takeaways. Militaries are quite good at supporting civil society, but it really helps if we prepare beforehand. Second, COVID set everything back in defense development. And the third, armed forces can and do adapt to COVID. So that will be my takeaway from the Danish experience and what I heard here today. And that leads me to a very important point. I have to forward my greatest thanks to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, to Gunnar Gavrilko and Thomas Rostock, and their helpers in setting up the book and to setting up this seminar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Trautner. Good to see that the civilian-military cooperation in your person is actually going forward, and that we can count on the fact that this kind of co-work is not stopping but continuing despite the crisis. Finally, to wrap up this overview, I'll give the word to one of the co-editors, who is also the author of the chapter on Latvia, Gunnar Gavrilko. She's a PhD student at the University of Latvia. Gunnar, please, the Latvian experience.
Thank you so much. Well, my job today is the easiest because the minister already said it all. So I just now have to put the little elements on everything he already explained about Latvia's path in this pandemic. And actually, it's very similar to what Kalev already said. Ironically, my chapter also starts with the sentence, unless things spin out of control in late 2020 or in the beginning of 2021, Latvia's path has been so successful. And indeed, we even kind of enjoyed the international praise for how we are dealing with this pandemic on a global scale. So Latvia was one of the top countries that are handling the pandemic the best. However, similar to Estonia's experience, the second wave was way worse for us as well. And if we're talking about around 50 mortalities at the end of the October, as of today, it's more than 1,700 people have passed away due to COVID, different health complications. So, yeah, well, obviously, concerning specifically Latvian armed forces, is Minister also already explained that right before the pandemic hit, Latvia started this transformation to the comprehensive defense system in our country. And in this regard, actually, this pandemic was very timely opportunity to show to the society and to all people how crucial and important this kind of approach is, because it showed how important it is that government institutions and also private companies, private sphere actors are coordinating, cooperating, how crucial it is for them to be in connection and in terms of crisis to be able to deliver together possible efforts and how to help society to deal with different kind of crises, not only health crisis. And therefore, Latvian armed forces actually were really visible from the early beginning of the pandemic. The first actions that were taken was that all the borders were closed and the border checkpoints were established on our neighboring countries' borders, and right from the beginning, our National Guard was involved in helping our border guard to support the crossing of the borders, to do all the documents checking and different kinds of things that needed to be done on the borders. And in all together, all this time period, it was around 1,000 guardsmen that were involved together with the border guards for these activities. And it was also highly appreciated by the society, because then we definitely decreased the foreign virus spread in the country, and we were able to more focus on the inside transmission. And also then what was important from the armed forces side was that when municipalities asked for the assistance in terms of, for example, emergency housing, when in different shelters the virus started to spread, then armed forces gave support and assistance in terms of, for example, large size tents, to obviously to separate the infected people that needs to be in quarantine from the rest of the healthy people. And also that's actually the first cover pictures exactly from that process, where you can see that armed forces in their special gear are setting up these emergency housing tents to stop the spreading of virus further. And another important milestone from the Ministry of Defense was that also shortly after the beginning of pandemic, Ministry of Defense overtook all the procurement processes that were related to the COVID-19 and started to lead the logistics of not only purchasing the individual gear, disinfectants and masks, but also to then deliver all this equipment to the hospitals and other institutions that needed this procurements. And so therefore, right, so armed forces also did cancel and stop some of the exercises on sites. However, those exercises that were related to the combat readiness testing and training, those also were not canceled, similar also to Estonia's case as well. And so armed forces was in a constant, all the time in vigilant state in doing their everyday job, and also coming to the society and helping and assisting in different needs what country, government and municipalities were asking from them. And Minister also already mentioned the 72 hours campaign that was started. We started to prepare that before pandemic hit, and the original launch was planned for only fall 2020, but because of very unpredictable nature of the pandemic, the Ministry of Defense decided to launch this campaign way earlier and already in the spring. And they gave out the brochures and prepared different materials that were also sent out to people electronically, which talked about first 72 hours in the crisis, what to do, how to behave, what you should prepare for your family in terms of food or other different needs. And so this campaign also was very timely, and since people were largely sitting at home, then also it was a good opportunity for them to open their emails and see that this is serious, and the different crises can hit you in different times. And in terms of economy, obviously, of course, as everybody else, we experienced economy slowdown, but the government was very consistent in the promises of not dropping the defense budget down. And actually, currently, we are a little bit even above the 2% of our GDP to defense budget, and therefore, it's obviously very critical to sustain the defense spendings, especially because we have started a lot of big procurement projects in our armed forces. And similar to other countries, the recruitment results also were increased, and of course, it has to be connected to the situation where a lot of people lost their jobs. And for example, compared to April 2019, the results for April 2020 was higher than 60% compared to the year ago. So therefore, a lot of positive benefits came out of this crisis and were in the benefit to the armed forces as well. And what has happened since then, since our book was published, and today the big activity that armed forces performed was the curfew that government of Latvia introduced shortly before New Year's. And then up until the February, National Guard once again was supporting the local police, the state police, in patrols and checking people who are going outside. And from 10 o'clock in the evening till early at 5 a.m. in the morning, nobody was allowed to be on the streets except those who needed to be outside because of their job or other only very serious reasons to say. So also our armed forces were heavily involved with providing the personnel with that as well. And also, as the minister already said, that currently there is a plan in the government that armed forces might assist with the vaccination logistics as well. But for that, we first need to have the vaccines. And probably many of you know that Latvia is unfortunately pretty much in the last spot in Europe with amount of vaccines available. So that's a kind of a big disappointment from our society and a little how to say rock in their garden. So to sum up, I have to say that our armed forces and defense sector use this crisis as a window of opportunity to show their presence, to show and demonstrate the armed forces' ability to support and help the society if there's such need. And I think that's really important because that helps us to enjoy the public's trust and confidence in armed forces. And of course, it all goes back to public support for defense budget and defense spending. So such a readiness, capabilities, and just being present, being there and showing to the society that armed forces will assist in the crisis. That's definitely very very critical piece and helps us to support our armed forces in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gavrilko. We've run a bit over time, but if anybody has a question, you still have a chance. Write it in the chat. Any questions about Denmark, Norway, Estonia, Latvia? Anything broader? Somebody thought of something came to mind about one of the earlier presentations? Well, if not, then I think I will conclude my panel discussion and hand the microphone or the screen or whatever we do here in Zoom back to Elizabeth Bauer, who is the sponsor of this book and this conference, can conclude this event. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all the authors again, to all the organizers, and to all of you who have been with us in the morning today. And as I wrote already in the chat, whoever would like to have a printed version of the book, please let us know. We can send it to you, or even you can bring it to us and read or something like that. We will find a way. And I think the discussion showed that although we couldn't imagine that we will have already be in the middle or beginning of the third wave already in some of the countries at least, that one of the things will we stay on. We will have to deal with the pandemic more than another year, or more than up to the vaccination will be as the same way as for influenza, something, a traditional one to do it. I don't know, something like that. We never know what will come. But on the other hand, which was really listening very carefully from our colleague from NATO, I think the next topic is already given for a discussion, how the pandemic will influence the NATO 2030 plans and all the developments which we have to face on, and what will be taken into the strategic decision, not only in the different national countries on the national level for the forces, but as well on the international level and on the international cooperation. And as we could listen today, the international cooperation, even the international work of all the armed forces together, it has to be respected that pandemic has influenced that as well. And in that case, thank you for being with us, and it's food for thought for all of us, and hope to see you again to something sometime. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.